Hello everyone and welcome to a new video. Last autumn we didn't do any cleanup at all in the garden. Everything was just left. So all the leaves that came off the trees and the shrubs were just left on the ground. Branches that came off trees were also just left and we didn't pick up anything. That was on one hand because the weather changed suddenly and it just got too wet and too moist to really work in the garden with joy. And on the other hand because we wanted to run a little experiment and see what happens. And this is what I want to show you today in this video. So I will go over the Japanese maples and see how they were doing with not being cleaned off in autumn. I will show you the conifers and the dry needles you can see on there. And then also I will talk about the moss and show you how that turned out. This is the left-hand side of the garden, which we started to clean up about 2 weeks ago. And here we couldn't see or find anything that was influenced in a negative kind of way from not being cleaned in autumn. Let's walk to the first Japanese maple I want to show you, which is the Orangiola cultivar. The one right here. And because the branch structure on this maple is a little bit denser and more compact than on other maples, there were quite some leaves actually stuck on there. But looking closer, after we'd cleaned it off, nothing really got damaged. You can even see the new buds are slowly starting to open up because the weather is really warm at the moment. Because of the way this maple is pruned, you can see the branches here are starting to form pads, and this is why usually in autumn all the leaves that dry and fall off get stuck on here, and this is what we just cleaned off in spring. I did however notice that on Japanese maples of that type, so typically the palmetto maples that have a more open shape, and I'll show you one in a minute, leaves actually tend to fall off completely by themselves. And usually I recommend cleaning off the maples in autumn time to avoid diseases, and wet leaves sitting on there for months. However, this year when we ran this experiment, so far I haven't seen any negative influence. This palmetto maple is a larger one and has a more open branch structure. That means the leaves that dry off in autumn, most of them fall through onto the ground anyway. And actually over the winter months we had some windy days as well. Most leaves actually came down. So on this maple there were a few single leaves to clean off. They got stuck in the little branches where they split. But other than that, the maple kind of cleaned itself. Now let's walk over to the other side of the garden, which is not cleaned up yet, and you'll see how it looks. Here, by the way, you can see the red berries of the sacred bamboo, or Nandina domestica, which develop in autumn time and stay on there all winter. So this is a really beautiful and colorful decoration for your garden. Here we're at the other side of the garden and you can see the state of it. So nothing has been cleaned up here. We started on one end a little bit, but you see all the leaves on the floor and on the moss also, which I will show you later in this video. On this side of the garden we have most of our dissector maples. Those are the ones that grow in this dome kind of a cascading shape, and the ones with the deeply sliced leaves. And because of how these maples are structured, they build more like a layer of branches almost. And you can see here clearly how the dead leaves get stuck on the maples. You see that just some of them fall off, but most of them, I'd say about half probably, just get stuck on the leaves because the leaves themselves are deeply sliced, so they do not fall through that easily, and because of the way the branches are structured of those maples. And this is why I always recommend to clean maples off in autumn in order to avoid that. So here showing you a closer look of that, and you see how many leaves are stuck in here on the branches. So, and this is when this gets wet and just sits on there, this can potentially cause diseases for the maples. This year so far I haven't seen anything, but I would always recommend cleaning that off in autumn time just to be on the safe side. And what I usually do, regardless of the time of the year, so whether it's autumn or now in spring, I usually wait for dry weather, which we have at the moment, and make sure that these leaves are completely dry, because then it is really easy to just pull them off like that carefully without breaking the branches. Other than cleaning off the dead leaves of the Japanese maples, I also always clean out the dead branches. And this can be done in autumn time, and I usually do, but also in springtime. And I want to show you the dead branches on this Dissectum nigrum Japanese maple, because there it's really easy to see what is dead and what is still alive. Because this maple has very dark branches, and you can clearly see here the branches that have a lighter color, like those here. So those are the ones that are dead, they died off during the winter, and those are the ones that still need to be cleaned out. The leaves have already been cleaned off this maple. Next, let's have a look at the conifers. So generally speaking, conifers, all types of conifers, should be cleaned off in autumn time or latest in spring, what I'm doing this year. And that's because they shed their needles that are typically 2 to 3 years old. They will turn brown, as you can see here, and they will start to fall off. And what happens is, again, given the type of branch structure of the conifers, especially those smaller compact ones, the needles will just get stuck in between the branches, and some may fall through and some usually do, but most of them, as you can see, they just get stuck everywhere. And what it does when needles are not cleaned out is that it just blocks light from coming into the existing branch structure, and it may prevent new growth that is starting again from like the older wood, which happens on a lot of conifers. So this here is an example of a mugo pine that was not cleaned out. And I'm also going to show you a Japanese black pine. This is an example of a Japanese black pine, and just looking at it like that, it may seem fine and green, and there you can't really see any dead needles. But walking around to it, I'll show you how many needles are actually stuck in there. If you open it up, you can see here what's stuck. So this is quite a lot, together with some maple leaves even. These junipers grow under a large mature black pine. That means we get needles and also little dead twigs and branches, and also pine cones falling down on these pretty much all year round. And so this is why it's important to clean them off regularly. When working with junipers, I recommend wearing gloves and maybe even long sleeves. That's because junipers tend to sting a little bit on the skin. And I personally get little red dots that disappear usually after 2 days. But if you want to be on the safe side, or maybe have sensitive skin, it's best to wear gloves when working with junipers. Now let's have a look at the moss and see how they turned out being covered in leaves all winter long. For those who are watching my videos regularly, or for those who have seen maybe some of the moss videos I released, I always say clean off your moss and keep it nice and tidy. However, during the spring cleanup that we started a couple of weeks ago, I found out a few interesting things, which I'm going to show you now. The main reason why moss should always be cleaned off is so that it has enough light to grow. And being covered in leaves works for some type of mosses, as I found, but not for everything. Here you can see an example of a type of cushion moss that is properly established, and this type of moss builds like a big pillow that is kind of hard and is properly attached to the ground. So for these types of mosses, when they are covered in leaves, and here you can see when I pull it off, they actually stay pretty much unharmed because they are properly established. And when I pull off the leaves, I do not really pull off any moss, as you can see here. And what happens, oh, you see the spores coming off the moss? What happens is that having these types of mosses covered in leaves retains actually moisture during the winter. So whether or not this is necessary depends on where you live and how your climate is. Here for us, the climate in winter is very dry. We have a humidity of about 30% on average in winter, which is equivalent to dry desert air. And this is why the moss sometimes suffers in winter. So for those types of mosses that are properly established and properly attached to the ground, having them covered actually didn't do any harm. It encourages or it keeps the moisture in the moss. Here you can see another example of an area that we recently cleaned up, and loads of cushion moss, which was completely covered in leaves for months, and it turned out to be completely green and fresh and healthy underneath. In this area here we have mainly sheet moss, and with sheet moss I found that it's not ideal to have it covered with the leaves. That's because when you clean up, and we do cleaning up as with a combination of leaf blowing where possible, brooming, raking, but only in the grass, and for most of the moss, especially when it's sensitive and may come off, I actually hand pick the leaves off. And the reason why leaving the leaves is not ideal for the sheet moss is because you can see here, sometimes you may get chunks of the sheet moss just coming off, and that's because this is just not properly attached to the ground. That's just how the sheet moss grows and works. So this is not as anchored into the ground as the cushion moss is, like I just showed you. So in order to avoid that and disturb the moss too much, I would not recommend leaving the leaves on this sheet moss. Because this moss is not established as much as the cushion moss is, for example, you can see it starts to kind of mix with the leaves, and this is why the moisture isn't really retained in the moss, because there's just not enough under the leaves. Here's another area where sheet moss and a little bit of fern moss is starting to grow, and you can see how sensitive it is and how easily it starts to come off. You see here, this is a big chunk that was just turned around by a leaf blower or the rake, or even by wind. And so what I usually do, I take it, put it the right way around again so the moss is on top, and push it down with my hands. This is an area where there is a combination of cushion moss and sheet moss growing. Here the sheet moss is a lot more established, maybe because this area is more moist, because it's more shaded out, and so the sheet moss actually is attached more to the ground. And here is where we usually leaf blow actually the moss without doing too much damage, or alternatively it can also be broomed. So what are my conclusions about cleaning up in springtime versus in autumn time in the previous year? So starting with the Japanese maples, I would recommend cleaning off the maples in autumn time. That's simply to avoid any diseases that may be caused by leaves that get moist and wet over the winter, sitting on the branches and just keeping them moist and wet. However, as we have seen, Japanese maples that have an upright growing shape or a more open kind of shape lose pretty much all their leaves naturally anyway during the winter, and having some leaves on the ground actually can have an advantage in that it provides natural fertilizer. So if you're not growing any moss or any other plants underneath the maples, you may as well leave the leaves there if you just have grass or soil even, and maybe mix it with some compost soil in spring, and that gives you a natural fertilizer for your maple. For the dissector maples, so the ones with the cascading or dome shape, you saw how many leaves actually stay on there. They do not fall off during the winter regardless of wind or weather conditions, and especially for those it's important to clean them off. The dried branches I think can be cut either in autumn time or in springtime. It doesn't really make that much difference. But also considering the springtime and having a cleaned maple already ready to go for the spring, so meaning cleaning it off in autumn time, is good, because sometimes the temperatures here get very warm very quickly and the maples are starting to bud, and if they're cleaned off right away in autumn time, then they are ready to go for spring whenever it gets warm. As for the conifers, I think actually for conifers it doesn't really matter when you clean them off. as long as you do it in spring to give the new growth enough light and to get enough air through the branches. I have done it over the years, most of the time in autumn time, but sometimes before also in springtime, and I think, or I couldn't really see a lot of difference there. So for the conifers, I'd say as long as you clean them out at one point before the new growing season starts, that's fine. For junipers or for any other low growing kinds of shrubs that grow beneath trees or near larger trees where debris, leaves and branches is falling down, I would recommend to clean them off regularly, so also maybe even during the winter months, to keep the surface of these shrubs and conifers nice and clean and free of any leaves. And my conclusions for the moss is that it is best to clean the moss in autumn time or whenever there are leaves or any other kinds of debris on the moss. For the cushion moss or types of cushion mosses, as we have seen, it's okay to have the leaves on there because they are properly established and attached to the ground. So when you clean them off, even in springtime, the moss stays unharmed and you do not take out any moss when pulling off or brooming off the leaves. And also it keeps moisture on the moss, which helps with dry winter air in case you live in that kind of climate. For any other types of mosses, especially in areas where moss isn't established properly yet, it makes sense and is better to clean them off as the leaves are falling in autumn, so as soon as possible, because in that way the moss stays undisturbed and you do not remove the moss from the ground when you blow over with the leaf blower or rake it or broom it. So generally speaking, I would say that I would recommend doing the cleanup in autumn time, but in case you do not find time one year, it's also okay to do it in springtime as long as it's done before the new growing season starts. And this brings me to the end of my video. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and see you next time. Bye!